The year is 1840. A group of people gather in a dimly lit parlor. Velvet curtains are drawn, mirrors are covered. In the center of the room stands a table that looks to have a group of candles and some kind of board. The board contains some interesting drawings on it as well as the whole alphabet. This board will be used to speak to the dead, and that's exactly what these people plan to do. But the question that lingers in the air is, how did we get to this point? Why are these people, specifically the Victorians, so enthralled by the supernatural and what may lie beyond the veil? And more importantly, why does the Gothic aesthetic seem to still haunt us today? Hello and welcome to The Coven, where we dive deeper into certain aspects of history and uncover long-forgotten secrets. My name is Lavender. I'm the host of this podcast, Vault of the Veiled. But before we get into the Gothic and the Macabre, you can find this podcast on both Spotify and YouTube under Vault of the Veiled. Now, without wasting any more time, sit back, grab yourself a beverage, perhaps, light a candle, and let's unlock the vault together. So where did the Gothic culture start? The Gothic culture began to rise primarily in the Middle Ages, beginning around the mid-12th through 16th century. This culture itself mostly consisted of dark architecture, which could later be characterized as having high vaulted ceilings, ornate stained glass windows, and pointed or arched windows. One of the most influential styles that held similar characteristics to the Gothic style is Romanesque architecture, an architecture style that held similar characteristics to medieval Europe that was prominent in the 12th century. This style was known to have semicircular arches, while the Gothic is marked by pointed arches. However, it wasn't just the architecture that made a rise in the Gothic culture, but it was also the art that was featured within the walls of some of the famous buildings we still visit today. The art itself was predominantly influenced by religion during the time. Many castles were built during this time, but over time they began to be greatly outnumbered by churches as religion was on the rise. During this time, one of the most significant buildings is the Notre Dame in Paris. The construction of the cathedral began in 1163 under Bishop Maurice de Sully and was finally completed by 1260. Though it has gone through modifications in succeeding centuries. However, in 1790, during the French Revolution, the cathedral did suffer extensive damages. A majority of the religious images that it held were unfortunately damaged or destroyed. The cathedral itself represents the progression from the Romanesque to the Gothic architecture. Though how the Gothic style emerged from the Romanesque and what key influences that brought the style are actually hard to pinpoint, as there is a lack of concrete evidence that's written. Although one theory people have come up with is that the Gothic style emerged originally as a rationalist answer to structural challenges that were beginning. However, it wasn't just the architecture that made a rise in the Gothic culture, but it was also the art that was featured within the walls of some of the famous buildings we still visit today. The art itself was predominantly influenced by religion during this time. Many castles were built during this time, but over time they began to be greatly outnumbered by the churches, as religion was on the rise. During the Gothic rise, many people weren't necessarily religious, but primarily believed in pagan or occult practices. It was primarily called Gothic paganism before some of them eventually converted to Christianity. Now, taking a step away from the origins of the Gothic era and what it mainly consists of, we can now take a look at what the Gothic style is now in the modern age. To put it simply, the Gothic style is simply a person who is fascinated in the beauty within the darker things, mainly drawn to darker films, music, books, art, and even fictional characters. Yes, that's right, fictional characters. There are many different aesthetics surrounding the Gothic style, but the main things that they all have in common is an appreciation / being drawn to the darker things. I have compiled a short list of the different styles that have been popular within the last few years. This list doesn't go in depth, but rather gives a brief synopsis of what they mainly consist of. Up first, we have death rock. This style mainly blends together glam rock, Gothic horror, literature, and the undead characters of classic horror films. Hot goth, I think I'm pronouncing that right. This is one of the styles I was a little confused by when I was researching these different aesthetics. From what I found online, the style consists of sports, impeccable tailoring, and elegant accessories such as cigarette holders and faux fur. As for the hair, it was smoothly styled and lipstick was likely to be red or burgundy. Gothic Lolita. This style I feel like is common sense. This was a blend of the Gothic style with the Lolita fashion. Two very different styles I feel like could be a good representation of the progression within the Victorian time period. Aristocratic Goth. This was another blend of Victorian and steampunk, adding in the industrial tech with the dark Victorian style. Cybergoth. This combines classical goth fashion we all know of with the clothing worn by fans of industrial metal and rave music. Another style I hadn't heard of or delved much into until I began the research for this episode. And last but not least, the traditional goth, or trad goth. This reflects the classic and original aesthetic of goths from the 1980s. Some of the characteristics of this style include black dyed hair, mohawks, back combing and crimping. Makeup could consist of a pale white highlighted face, dark eyes, usually black, and lips. Lastly, the Victorian Goth, a modern fashion movement that interprets and redefines certain aspects regarding fashion of the Victorian era. However, it isn't just the styles that we see in the modern age regarding the goth aesthetic, but also the people behind it, the community and belonging that this culture provides for others, whether online, in friend groups, clubs, concerts, and even festivals. The Victorian era itself is greatly influenced by the Romantic movement, which was emphasizing emotion in nature and the sublime. With that, the Gothic culture was also aligned with these ideas and thus began to celebrate the mysteries, emotions, and of course, the dramatics that the Goth style was also well known for. People that were a part of this lifestyle oftentimes sought to explore deeper human emotions. Though the attire and way of thinking weren't the only notable characteristics of the Gothic age, literature was known to have an astounding impact on this time period. Authors like Bram Stoker, who wrote the famous Dracula novel, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and of course the infamous Edgar Allan Poe with his many written works as well as famous poems. These authors, though they wrote about different aspects of the Gothical period, they all shared the same themes, including horror, supernatural beings, and the uncanny. They all seem to reflect social anxieties about modernity, sexuality, and mortality. The Victorians, though you may not believe it, did face significant social challenges and changes throughout the 1800s. Changes like urbanization, industrialization, and the shift in class structure all brought about fears and anxieties. The Gothic writers of the time did what they thought best and explored these common human feelings surrounding these transitions. They began to dig deeper into the unknown, loss of traditional values, as well as the darker aspects of human nature. With all the shifts and changes, like the Victorians often began to find interest in the occult/supernatural. The Gothic aesthetic as a whole often appealed to the sorts of lifestyles with an interest in life after death and the mysteries of existence. Unlike many historical styles or aesthetics throughout time, they diminish and are frozen in time. However, that's not the case for this aesthetic. Though however morbid or dark people may find a certain aesthetic, there are a minority of people who still cling to this style, finding the freedom and self-expression within the darkness, or going against social norms and expectations of what the mainstream society is showing. It's an ability to embrace the darker aesthetics and the rich symbolism it holds, letting go of old ways of life, change and ending. It's really about making way for the new. Because the Gothic era holds such a strong connection to death and decay, it can indicate stagnation or even clinging to the past. It's not only the historical appeal of this aesthetic, but the dramatics and theatrics of it too, with items that can be worn such as lace, leather, corsets, and the accessories like chokers and wide-brimmed hats have also left their mark in this dark, moody aesthetic. Again, the people within this aesthetic tend to find beauty within the dark and macabre. In my opinion, I do think that people who tend to find an interest/fascination with this aesthetic also happen to be the bravest people I know. Whether it's emotionally or mentally, This is because they find a deeper connection within either themselves or within someone else. The Gothic culture often has themes that resonate with heavy emotions such as melancholy, introspection, and romanticism, making it easier to find a deeper connection with a character, film, or even in music. And not to call anyone out, but you probably resonate with this style if you're the older sibling who may or may not have gotten the love or attention that you deserved and maybe you're still looking for. Or you might have been someone you might be someone who's very emotionally intelligent. Okay, I'm calling myself out too, so don't feel bad. So the bigger question that still lingers in the air is why were Victorians so obsessed with deaths and funerals? Many historians now call this the cult of death, because behind all the dresses, big ornate housing, and windows is a society who had death knocking on their doorstep at least once a week, if not more. Early Victorians believed that judgment, or whether you were going to heaven or hell, was decided in the hour of your death. If you're a Catholic or ex-Catholic, you might know the phrase from the Hail Mary. Yeah, I unearthed probably a lot of memories by saying that. So they idolized the process of a slow death. This may have looked like families crowding around the deathbed to say goodbye and to maybe even witness religious rapture before death. Even though the Victorians were interested in life and death and whatever happens when you do eventually pass, they were still heavily relying on their faith and philosophy. They used this as a way to explain the mournful terrors that they were exposed to, because during this time, the mortality rate was increasing by the day. You were lucky if you or your kid made it to grow old and die. Eventually, as time went on, people did reach a level where they began to take an interest, later becoming an obsession, with death, ghosts/spirits, and eventually the mystical or the occult. This is where seances slowly started to become a thing, and it wasn't uncommon to walk past someone's house and see them trying to communicate with the dead. However, this didn't all just happen randomly. It started in England, with the traditions of death rapidly increasing with the influence of Queen Victoria's mourning period of her husband Prince Albert. Prince Albert's death sent Victoria into a deep depression where she began to wear black every day until she passed. She was also very secluded during this time, rarely making an appearance in public. She began to influence the mourning wear that was appropriate to wear. For instance, black crepey clothing and jet black jewelry was the attire for funerals. Mourning attire for women would have looked like every article of clothing that they wore every day had to be black, as well as hair accessories, stationery, umbrellas, fans, and purses. If you were a widow, you might have worn your mourning attire for up to 2 years, and eventually you would be allowed to wear gray or lavender only during the last 6 months of mourning, which would be considered half mourning. For men, however, it was drastically different, as they only added a black hat band or gloves to their normal attire. Moving on to what children wore during this time, because yes, even children were required to wear mourning attire for a certain amount of time. They were only allowed to wear this attire for 1 year after the death. Their dresses were often modeled after their mother's dresses. The crepey fabric they wore had a flat, almost lifeless quality to them, making it the right choice to wear during a funeral. Wearing any lustrous fabric like furs, satin, and velvet were forbidden to wear for any mourning attire. If you know anything about the Victorian era during this time regarding death, you may also have heard the tradition of mementos. Not the candy, but the actual tradition. These jewelry pieces were used as lockets, brooches, and rings. They would often hold a lock of hair and sometimes a photograph of the recently deceased. This to them functioned as a tangible reminder of the dead. The lockets of hair were sentimental gifts to the living and became powerful keepsakes after their death. But wait, it still gets creepier. They would also partake in post-mortem photography, photographing the dead. This tradition started as a way to remember the dead. This also allowed for families who couldn't afford to get a painted portrait done of the dead. They could arrange for a photograph to be taken instead. Through this photography, the deceased were commonly represented as though they were peacefully sleeping. Although, in some cases, they could also be posed to look like they were still alive. I know, it's creepy. Let's just say I've had some weird dreams while researching this. As if we haven't talked about death/dying enough, it's time to delve into what actually went on during funerals. now, because death surrounded the Victorians, whether this was at home or on the streets, uncommon for funerals to become a widely spread thing. In this case, aristocrat funerals were probably as big as funerals could get, besides the royal family. They often involved all the elements of a baronial funeral. This included plumes, ushers, countless attendants, and even elaborate hearses. Victorians are nothing if not weird and elegant, as most funerals held became very elegant and extravagant. This was because they almost feared not having a good funeral themselves. That also didn't stop them when it came to early deaths. These deaths were viewed as increasingly tragic and deserving of an elaborate and grand-scale mourning. With this all going on, practices as well as the superstitions became increasingly elaborate as the centuries progressed. Though toward the end of the 1800s, the ostentatious show had begun to slowly diminish, which led to funeral practice being required to follow a certain set of social rules. I guess some came to the realization about how weird/creepy they were being. I say this because quickly books and articles were being published about etiquette of funerals. With death almost knocking on the doorstep of every Victorian's household, they slowly started to not fear the dying process, but rather they actually feared not being properly mourned. I guess nothing's stopping a Victorian. But this next part is borderline psychopathic for me, personally. It was common for funerals to be held within the home of the deceased. It was customary to prepare the home for what was known as the death watch, the time between the dying and the funeral. Yes, you heard that right. They would hold the funerals within the same home that they slept and lived in. When I said that I loved the Victorian Gothic era, I meant the aesthetic, architecture, styles, not this part of their lifestyle. It's weird. The obsession with death then grew into the paranormal world, where people began to want to communicate with the dead, and the intrigue with life and death spiked. This movement of spiritualism was hard to avoid during the 1800s, so much so that new books were actually being published once a week and sometimes more. These books would include scientific seeming tones to help give others evidence of the afterlife. Though no matter how morbid or obsessed the Victorians were with death or the macabre, a lot of what we know of death/funerals we learned from them. Things like funeral wear, wearing all black as a sign of mourning to a funeral. Funeral processions. We don't have them in our house, thank God, anymore, but we still hold extravagant processions for them, honoring the life of the deceased. It may look a little different as we don't actively crowd around someone on their deathbed, waiting to see if they get religiously raptured. However, we still hold memorials and keepsakes for them as a way to remember them and still hold on to them. It wasn't just deaths and funerals that held an influence over this era, but also the Gothic genre of literature made a pretty big impact on what we even see today. The supernatural experimentation, particularly in the spiritualism movement, as well as the further development of psychology, held the Victorians in awe. Like I said before, the interest the Victorians took in spiritualism led to a spike in the film and literature industry as books were being published and eventually filmed into movies we know of today, and are still some being made to this day. Popular movies include Crimson Peak, Dracula, Nosferatu, The Woman in Black, The Wolfman, Dorian Gray, The Interview with the Vampire, and of course, Jane Eyre. You could say the Victorian/Gothic age have shaped how we know/see the spooky season or Halloween. Well, dear listeners and viewers, you can find this podcast on Instagram at Vault of the Veiled, where you can get a behind-the-curtain look at updates, research, and much more. My goal is to create a Patreon or website where you can support this podcast there. My plan is to put extra content on there, like extras from my research, and also weekly updates of the podcast, or in general, a spooky book club even. But I can't do that without your support. If you're on YouTube, please hit that subscribe and like button, maybe even add in a comment. New episodes come out every other Wednesday, and I will see you on the next one.